All right. Well, I have 1 o'clock here on my machine. So good afternoon and welcome everybody to our Southern Fire Exchange webinar. My name is David Godwin and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program with the University of Florida. Joined today with Christian Fernandez from Tall Timbers Research Station and Sarah Kane with our Southern Fire Exchange team at NC State. We're excited to have a presentation with Dr. Seth Hawkins, an emergency physician, wilderness medical professional, and now cultural anthropologist. Dr. Hawkins will be sharing a presentation on his work to understand southeastern wildland fire from the perspective of a cultural anthropologist. I want to introduce our speaker, and then we're going to hand things over to him and let him run the show. And our speaker today is Dr. Seth Hawkins. Dr. Hawkins is an emergency physician with dual board certifications in emergency management and EMS with specializations in wilderness EMS. He's a published author and editor of multiple books on wilderness medicine. He's the owner of Hawk Ventures and the board chair of the Appalachian Mountain Rescue Team. He serves as a medical advisor for multiple organizations in North Carolina and the Southern Appalachians, including the National Forests in North Carolina. Academically, he serves on the faculty of the Wake Forest University School of Medicine as an associate professor and associate director of the Wake Forest Wilderness Medicine Fellowship. I got that out. Clinically, he is a full-time attending emergency physician at the Catawba Valley Medical Center in Hickory, North Carolina.
Well, happy Earth Day, everyone. I really appreciate you spending at least part of it here with me today. Little bit more about myself. Thanks so much for that introduction. As David was saying, I am a physician, clinically and academically, and my work in EMS and in medicine has really taught me over the last quarter century that what I really needed to know more about was public health. So I think the pandemic probably gave many of us that thought. And for me, working in spaces like U.S. forests, national forests, state parks, and also just rural EMS environments, I realized a lot of what I was dealing with was care of the public at a population level, which is really more public health than strict medicine. I was an anthropology major as an undergraduate, so I also realized practicing medicine that much of what I was doing really felt actually like applied anthropology. And as much as I was learning in medical school about ways to choose an antibiotic or how to splint a leg, I also really needed skills in how to navigate cultures and meet patients where they were. So right after the pandemic, all that came together to lead me to want to explore a dual degree in anthropology and public health, which really seemed to be the skill sets that I needed to get for these particular areas. And I was happy to see that there was a program offering a dual master's degree in these specialties at UNC Charlotte, only 2 hours away from my house, which I've now come to realize after 3 years is a bit of a painful distance. And yet it was definitely still worthwhile. Just as an aside, I can't say enough about this program and about the importance of public health and anthropology for the work that I think many of us do in these spaces. These kind of programs are available around the country, and I'm actually the anomaly to come in as somebody with medical training. Typically, it would be taking people without previous backgrounds, especially just coming out of undergraduate degrees. So I hope that I am convincing today that these disciplines are helpful for the work that we do, in particular for our region and for where a lot of this particular hosting is being done. The University of South Florida also has one of the original and really well-known and respected programs. So this is, for me, an opportunity to share with you specifically the work I did on the anthropology side of the house, working with wildland fire and wildland firefighters and their perceptions of health and how they fit into the health metric of our society. Inevitably, this also veered a lot into public health. And I think really this topic is just a beautiful one to portray the complementary nature of anthropology and public health, and its really seminal importance for the practical management of our lands and people on those lands. So I'm hoping to share those things that I've learned with you. This topic is extremely place-based, so I'm just looking at North Carolina as a case study, and I do recognize this is a regional webinar. And also, I know many of you are joining from all around the country. So I'll make a case that North Carolina is a good case study for the topic which we might see equally important all across the country. And this will be a gloss and sort of a high points of the practicum paper I wrote for this topic, which was like 70 pages and much more detailed. So it will be hitting high points. And if you want to pull out topics further or get further into details, I would love to do it. And we can do that either in the chat while I'm talking or as part of the Q&A at the end of the session. And I just have to acknowledge the support of my committee at UNC Charlotte. That was Doctors Andrea Freitas, Sarah Yunst, April Alexander, and Gregory Starrett. And as I'll mention, I do have some positionality here myself, and I think has already kind of came up in the bio. I do have some roles in this space, and so it's important to me to say that I'm speaking for myself here, very much as a student and not formally as a representative of any state, federal, tribal, or university attachment. So ultimately, what I found in these explorations I was doing was what I'm terming a paradox of the mainstream, that our mainstream wildland fire practices are actually marginalized in our social and political constructions, and that cultural burning, a marginalized practice, potentially provides a solution for the mainstream. And I look forward to sharing this idea with you further this morning. And I have a bit of a challenge with this webinar because it's doing all sorts of things at once. So this is a deliverable to my community partners with whom I did this research. So some people on the call are here with state parks and U.S. Forest Service that were collaborators, as well as the Lumbee Indian tribe. And if anybody's listening from that context, thank you from the bottom of my heart for working with me on this research. However, there's also people coming on to hear what I was doing in this anthropology world who may have no background in these topics whatsoever. So there's a wide range of expertise from people I think who are truly national experts on this topic to people who are just plugging in to see what's going on, which really kind of is a great role for a webinar anyway. And I think particularly in the Q&A session, that might become very rich. But because of that, I'll take it from the start at a basic level. I'll introduce all the terms I'm talking about. I'll assume that there's no common knowledge, and for some of you that will be very basic sort of material. So please bear with me with that. So in that context, starting just with some basic definitions, wildland fires are any non-structural fire that occurs in vegetation or natural fuels. And so this will include 3 different types of fires within it. So as we talk about wildland fires, it's a broad category for things like wildfires, which are unplanned. And these are what we often hear about as threatening to human structures and are very much in the news right now, especially in North Carolina. Prescribed fires would be a more recent type of wildland fire that are planned and follow a prescription and are designed to mitigate the either potential or the severity of wildfires. And then cultural burning is yet another category that are also intentional anthropogenic fires. And these are used by indigenous communities with an objective that interconnects with cultural values. It has some overlap with prescribed fires, but as we'll discuss, it also is quite different. And the WUI, which is the wildland urban interface that we'll also discuss, is the zone where these wildland fire environments and vegetation and fuels can intersect with human development and human structure. So these will all be terms that are important to know as we work through these topics. And specifically for my research, I started asking how wildland firefighters felt about the health parameters of their work and what they felt about their own medical care and safety and what the public health concerns were and what they did. As we'll discuss, that actually led into pretty naturally questions for how cultural burning could inform these queries. And since this work was using inductive analysis, the questions you can see here are intentionally broad to let informants speak primarily and to steer the research as it went along, which is one type of anthropology, and I think is a powerful one to really collaborate with people, informants in the community that you're working with to learn what the questions are that you need to be exploring, which sometimes are quite different than what you came in thinking would be important. So why is this important in North Carolina or in the Southeast? Fully half of all wildfires in the country occur in the Southeast, many very close to home. So if you see the top left news story, many of you will remember the Great Smoky Mountain fires of 2016 that enveloped the city of Gatlinburg, killing 14 people and injuring 190. So I think while there's sometimes a perception that wildfires occur deep in the wilderness or in the western part of the country, in fact, it's very common in the South, and it can even threaten some of our largest cities. Um, Indeed, about half of the homes in the US exist within the WUI, and the South is one of the fastest growing regions in the nation. So that has a corresponding increase in the WUI rate. Particularly, one reason why North Carolina is helpful to focus on is it's number one in the country for acres designated as the WUI. So you can see from this map on the bottom that I ripped from the North Carolina Forest Service yesterday, this is real-time sort of updates. Wildland fires are widespread. So there's red dots, which are active fires, and green dots, reported fires, and the others are controlled or contained. And you can see this is really mountains to coast and Piedmont. And you may remember not so long ago, 1 month ago, we were evacuating areas of Myrtle Beach. One of the largest fires we had recently was on the coast. So again, I'm just trying to explode a bit the idea that wildland fires happen somewhere else to other people, and especially people who choose to have homes deep in wilderness areas or in areas that intrude upon the wilderness. They're all over here now. And locally for me, the Bee Rock Creek fire, as of this morning, was about 50% contained and over 2,000 acres in size. And it's just 40 miles away from me in a pretty sizable community in North Carolina. It's the red dot just above Asheville there. And the Hayalead fire near the Joyce Kilmer Slick Rock Wilderness on the left, as of this morning, is 29% contained and over 3,000 acres. So again, I would say not only is this widespread, but these are quite large fires just today that are going on in North Carolina and this week. And I think also just from a national and really international perspective, we can't extricate wildland fire from the reality of a changing climate. So the 10 worst wildfire years in recorded history in terms of acres burned all occurred within the last 20 years. And I think that's also something from an anthropological standpoint that we need to acknowledge and recognize. So three ethical topics came up in this research, and in this I'm pointing a little bit just to be transparent and ethical about the work I'm doing, but also to speak to the researchers in the webinar and to bounce my experience off them and see what we all think. I think first, from an anthropological perspective, I borrowed trust from the communities and the individuals with whom I collaborated. I'm not a wildland firefighter. I'm not a cultural burner, nor have I ever been. As far as I know, I have no American Indian ancestry whatsoever. So in sharing really what were other people's stories of their lives and their work and their interface with health considerations, I really was positioned as a student and an interpreter. And that's one of the most significant things I learned coming through a graduate program in anthropology was my background is as a physician, which very much privileges expertise. And I think training medically, and this is also true of EMS and allied health specialties, what we strive for is to be the expert on a particular topic. And certainly for anthropology, to some degree for public health, I think it's a complete different positionality where we strive to be students. And what I would say is that I'm a student of the people that I was interviewing and speaking with, and I'm expressing that to you now as a student. So I likely will get some things wrong. I'm very humble in that regard. I'm open to corrections, even this afternoon in the chat, and any errors that I make are entirely my own. But I think this is really powerful and really important that there be an interpretive element that can provide a voice to some of those in our communities that are somewhat marginalized. And part of my paradox of the mainstream is that I might put wildland firefighters in that context that we don't often hear from firefighters themselves. And I think what anthropology does bring to the table that's powerful is an ability to analyze power structures and systems and patterns, pull out theory and apply it in applied anthropology into practical applications. And in that context, I'm really excited to do this work as a student. However, second, I do have some positionality in these spaces that do involve expertise and authority. So I'm the LEMA, which is the federal term for medical director for the U.S. Forest in North Carolina, as well as the medical director for North Carolina State Parks. These are contractor roles, they're not employee roles. And I would suggest that, in fact, better understandings of the cultural and societal considerations around the work that we do are actually really critical for these contractor roles. So rather than being a limitation or an ethical problem, I actually think many of my fellow LEMAs across the country would benefit from using the tools of applied anthropology to consider the operational environments that they are collaborating with as far as the medical care that gets delivered. Um, and I don't think you can really disentangle those roles altogether. So I was just very careful in this work to express that in the capacity of these interviews, I was working as an anthropology student and not a LEMA. As I noted here, I do have some other roles serving as medical director for some wildland fire medical support teams, which are private companies, as well as the medical advisor for the Student Conservation Association and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Happily, I guess I could say none of these organizations actually provided care or interfaced, particularly the SCA and the fire medical support teams during the 2 years I was working on this until just after my thesis defense, which was on Friday. And literally 2 days later, one of my teams came out to support one of the large fires here in North Carolina. So we're in the game now, but we weren't before, so there was no conflict of interest there. And the third ethical consideration is that I think my positionality as an anthropologist per se could be ethically and operationally problematic on this topic, particularly with indigenous and native communities. And we'll be addressing that a bit more in my results. So a bit to go through the history of this story, and for many this is review, but for others for whom it's not, it's critically important. Really, it's often poorly understood in the general community that there was extensive anthropogenic or human-generated burning prior to European entry into North America. So when speaking particularly about North Carolina, when the first Spanish explorers arrived on the coast of the Carolinas, they were greeted by this vast 60 million acre longleaf pine dominated ecosystem with another probably 30 million acres where longleaf pine was a contributory species. This forest and larger ecosystem stretched from the James River in Virginia all the way down to Florida and all the way west to Texas. I think nowadays we really don't appreciate how substantial that and continuous that ecosystem was. And the fascinating and critical thing is that the longleaf pine, which was the keystone tree in that particular centralized 60 million acre portion, is a fire dependent species. So it could only become that keystone tree in the ecosystem through burning from indigenous Americans who arrived on the continent from Asia during the Pleistocene. So many of you are familiar with Pine's work, not Pine the tree, but Pine the author with a Y, who's done a lot of the really groundbreaking and substantial work in this area. And he kind of separated out Asian fire of this pre-Columbian pre-colonial burning that occurred from Native Americans who were coming over from Asia from what happened when Europeans arrived. So I think it's really important for us to recognize, and I think this is pretty non-controversial now, that there was widespread intentional burning all across the United States, but particularly for our topic in North Carolina prior to the arrival of Europeans. So shortly after colonization of North Carolina, an era of fire suppression began. This was coupled with very explicit suppression of these native burning practices, which had been blending over into colonial practices as Europeans were learning how to live in North America and learning land management techniques. There was a very, very dramatic and explicit attempt to suppress that approach of using fire in any sort of intentional way, and increasingly through the 20th century, develop a militarized and militaristic approach to completely eradicate fire from the American landscape, North American landscape, which was, as some of you know, the 10 a.m. rule that fires had to be put out when they were found by 10 a.m. the next day. And this is also from a public health standpoint, the Smokey Bear era, which is fascinating. So Smokey Bear is currently the longest running and remains really one of the most successful public health campaigns in our country's history. It was linked to the suppression of wildland fire of any sort, either intentional or unexpected and damaging. And I think that's a public health storyline here altogether. Is just we have been in this public health game for a long time, and if people don't know anything about this topic, they often know about Smokey Bear. However, by the turn of the century, in the 1980s and 1990s, evolving fire science, and I am very humble that I am on a webinar here with a lot of leading fire scientists, started to recognize that that probably was problematic to try to eradicate fire altogether from ecosystems. And that began a switch in our public health campaign to more think about the potentials for good fire, which in the social media world hashtags out to hashtag good fire. And this began an era of prescribed burning, which really had been experimented with or on the radar earlier, but it became more mainstreamed at the end of the 20th century when we began setting fires intentionally with prescriptions to try to mitigate the effects of wildfires that were out of control. In step with that, indigenous burning, which had been occurring in that pre-colonial phase, um, began appearing again in a socially accepted way as cultural burning, although, as we'll discuss, really in some spaces it was continuous throughout that period. But cultural burning has now become again more of an accepted potential good fire application in an era where there's more permissiveness towards the idea of fires in our spaces. So, looking at anthropologists who work in this world, Jordan Thomas is really one of the most impressive people. He's an anthropologist, wildland firefighter who works in California, both for his firefighting and for his graduate school training in anthropology. In particular, he advances theories about how mainstream fire management in the 20th century could represent colonialism and how wildland firefighters can represent embodied knowledge of the environments that they're in that is critical and unmatched by other technologies to be aware of how fires are acting and how we can manage them. That has analogs to Wally's Economy Indiana, which also speaks to the ability to employ people seasonally in ways that are very valued, but then in off seasons or in other ways are very devalued. And I think that's one of the important things we'll talk about today is the way wildland firefighters are simultaneously highly valued and highly devalued members of our society. And I think Wally offers an analogy to that. Thomas really talks specifically about the ways that firefighters are critical to our work in and of themselves and the training that they get in ways that can't be replicated by other technologies that we have. And then Petrina has done really important work on climate change. And again, I think we need to address climate change as we talk about these issues. And here she's talking about wildland fire as emblematic of what she calls runaway change, which is a nice term for all of us who, and this came up very often in my interviews, recognize that our wildland fire management is changing. The assumptions are changing, the seasons are changing, the idea of fire season is evolving into a fire year, the severity of fires are changing. And so some of the embodied knowledge that Thomas might talk about starts to get unraveled if the assumptions that you can make start to run away from the predictions that you would have from years before. And she offers horizoning work as a solution. So this is very local. It's very practical. This is, again, how applied anthropology can be helpful. And the intent is to re-horizon our dialogue to places where we can actually have objects and interventions and rebuild our horizons so that we can have actionable knowledge. And I think this is important just as we reconsider what we're doing in wildland fire spaces and spaces that are prone to them in the world of climate change, understanding, and this, may even just be in our political dialogue, that we need different models than we may have had before. And she offers a nice framework to work through that. Clearly, there's a lot of literature available already, and many of you are quite familiar with it about the both individual and public health effects of wildland fire, and even more so wildland smoke. And this very much came up in popular dialogue recently as the East Coast was enveloped in Canadian wildland fire smoke, and suddenly people who'd never thought about it before were faced with questions about whether it was safe to be outside. You can see from the memo on the left the importance of this topic because it's rare to get so many organizations addressing a single topic. And on the right would be an example of a public health document about wildfire smoke. And these sort of hegemonic government run sort of the mainstream standard publications and documents are often from either the government or from large NGOs like the American Lung Association. And they tend to reassure that with only episodic exposure, and if not a member of a susceptible group, wildland fire smoke is generally safe. And they also suggest that prescribed fires, which is really crucial to the prescribed fire movement in aggregate, have less public danger than wildfires, which would be the purpose behind doing them. I know we've got folks here from North Carolina State, and they've been really big players in this research dialogue, and they did an analysis of the 2016 prescribed fire season in North Carolina state parks that really suggested that the prescribed fires were less dangerous as far as the smoke exposure than uncontrolled wildfires. But this is what risk philosophers would call a thick concept, meaning that there's multiple ways to look at it. There's multiple sort of political and operational considerations. And North Carolina State University researchers published in the same year a study that showed there was some uncertainty in wildland fire impact methodology, particularly around the connection between air pollution and the health responses reported by epidemiological studies, like who's showing up in emergency departments. And that's precisely the question that we need to have answered. So it's always the case that we would say more research is needed in academia and in science. And this is particularly true for us here. And I think the important thing this afternoon for our consideration is that wildland firefighters are very much at the praxis of that debate, both as the recipients of that risk and also the mediators of the planned interventions like prescribed fires or response to wildfires. So what's the state of health for wildland firefighters? And it's really dire. And this is not news to many of you, but if it is, you should know wildland firefighters have the highest mortality rate of any federal employee, which is concerning because that includes law enforcement and military. In 2022, their workplace was reclassified into the highest hazard category for carcinogens. Bear in mind, they don't wear like self-contained breathing apparatus like a structural firefighter, often don't wear respirators. Wildland firefighters have 43% higher risk for lung cancer and 30% higher risk for cardiovascular disease compared to the general population. And recently, as this graph particularly plays out, firefighters' mental health has drawn attention. They've been found to have 2 to 3 times the rate of depression, anxiety, and suicidality, much higher rates of substance abuse. And I contrast that with the primary textbook for wildland firefighting, which in a 400-page book dedicates about 21 sentences to mental health with the summation recommendation that you must learn how to deal with your specific stress reaction tendencies, which is maybe a little bit less than helpful. So for me, stepping into that literature and that information, I sought to find out what wildland firefighters were actually thinking and doing in these spaces. So I started with North Carolina State Parks and U.S. Forest Service personnel and used snowball sampling after that to find adjacent people to speak to about this kind of work. And this included interviews and site visits, and I planned to be on fire lines, but that wasn't completed for reasons we'll discuss in a moment. And then I used a software called NVivo to code that data and analyze it for themes. This was Institutional Review Board approved. I include this detail just for the researchers among you to point out that this work required 4 different rounds of IRB approval with 2 different agency approvals and included university, state, federal, and tribal processes. So something to talk about if you're interested is just the IRB thresholds for doing this kind of work. And this is a table 1 from my practicum paper that shows who I spoke to. So I did 13 interviews in total, of which there were 3 cultural burners, 3 members of the Lumbee tribe, which I'll get to what we were doing there, and 4 fire adjacent scientists, in addition to wildland firefighters. And these were also not mutually exclusive categories. So some people might have been scientists and wildland firefighters or other mergers, which speaks, I think, to the intersectionality of this kind of work. So the results that I found did highlight a public health role for what wildland firefighters are doing. I think in general, I found that many wildland firefighters were coming into their work because it was adventurous, or there was an ability to be outside, or it was seasonal work, which was attractive. But some came in for reasons of public health, or came to learn those values being important to what they were doing. So the first quote here just talks about a remote fire in the mountains in the West that got maybe more attention than it might otherwise because it provided electricity to Las Vegas, which really kind of reinforced the work that they were doing having an impact on human spaces in cities, although one might argue that there are even, to a degree, wilderness spaces are human these days, and that is something that we discussed in the interviews. And the second quote talks about pulling that remote area actually into street by street wildland firefighting when it reaches communities, and doing really structural firefighting and protecting homes and humans. In that particular case, they lost 650 homes. This is a retired firefighter who was really quite eloquent about how this isn't just an abstract topic, but he really felt like there was a human element that he was working to protect. And I think just in terms of health, one of the most significant features that those of you who do this work, I think, would emphasize is the absolutely extraordinary exertional demands of the job that's done, and the degree to which that work might compromise what we might think of in mainstream firefighting practices. So, in the first quote, the informant is comparing wildland firefighter safety apparatus to those of structural firefighters. And for clarity, for those of you not familiar with this world, I put pictures on the top left and top right of maybe more traditional gear on the right, and on the left, wildland firefighting. You can see that the safety gear might be much less, the exposure might be much more, but also just the caloric expenditure of gear that's carried, and hours that are worked, and miles that are hiked in that work is really exceptional. So I think from a health standpoint, the difficulties of the job have to be considered. And so while there's disagreement among the firefighters that I talked to about, and lots of interesting dialogue about wearing respirators or masks, there was pretty widespread agreement that it's just not done, and that culturally, this is not typically a part of wildland firefighting the way it might be in structural firefighting. But there was unity about the inadequate healthcare services available to them. That's kind of highlighted in the second quote, which I found quite compelling. This starts to unpack my idea that there is a marginalization of the mainstream. Wildland firefighters made about $13 an hour until August of 2021, when that rate was increased to $15 an hour temporarily. And like many of you know, that was made permanent in March of this year. But many firefighters I spoke to still felt like that was maybe not adequate, or if it was, then you're still dealing with inadequacies of mental health attention, adequate housing for where they worked, the need for improved recruitment and retention practices, and more sustainable employment environments, including just long-term healthcare. And really, the last quote kind of drove the pivot that I made in my research, that people I was speaking to, lectures I was hearing from podiums, and adjacent personnel, advocates, and the general public that I was speaking to were almost universally curious about what happened before these neo-European and post-colonial practices. And there was a perception that that there probably was native intentional burning processes, but who could ever know what was happening because it was so long ago, and that was deep history. And of course, that turned on all my anthropologist antennae, because that's precisely what anthropologists do, is look to the past in some cases. Certainly, bioarchaeology and large portions of anthropology are about older societies. So I sought out scientists who could help answer that question, and I approached these interviews with scientists as ethnographic subjects, which was, I think, important and interesting. And what that did reveal is they almost to a person felt, really to a person, felt that they were providing a scientific pathway that was adjacent to other paths of knowing, like oral histories. And the bottom line from speaking to geologists and I'm sorry, geography professors and archaeologists was that pyrodendrochronology and soil studies for sure demonstrate so we can better understand pre-Columbian practices. One of the projects that I just sort of heard about in South America is on the right there. And I think the last is probably maybe too small to really read easily. But what it's pointing out is that really you can be doing work in ancient civilizations and cultures that involves either geography or archaeology that actually can answer some of these modern questions about what it is that they were doing and how that might influence us. And impressed me that the scientists I was talking about were engaged with how the deep past might inform present practices, and we're actually responding and working in spaces that are active now, bringing sort of the past into the present. So, given that my interviews were reaching saturation, that indigenous and cultural burning was of interest, I focused my attention towards that community. And you can see the Lumbee Tribe Cultural Center here. I particularly started working with the Lumbee tribe. So, the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina is a very interesting community, and I think important for us in that it has some unusual characteristics. So one is that tribal precursors to the contemporary Lumbee tribe pursued a policy of accommodation and integration with colonial authorities, which had a dual consequence. There was some loss of tribal coherence and of at least federally granted sovereignty and recognition of tribal status, but at the same time, there was increased capability to continue cultural practices on their land with less interference. And for my purposes, this meant that they had really been quietly continuing burning practices throughout the fire suppression phase of the 19th and 20th centuries. So, about the same time as I was beginning my work at UNC Charlotte, they established a cultural burning association that some of you are familiar with to formalize these practices and really explore what contemporary cultural burning would be. And this is their logo, which I love because it's packed with all sorts of iconographic meaning both for Lumbee, the Lumbee connection to fire and fire dependent species. And the bottom pictures you can see would be sort of an indigenous burning picture on the right with a cultural burning practice from very recently pulled off of Instagram, so a public post on the right side there. So this slide shows a cultural burn on the left at the Lumbee Cultural Center, which is a large multi-acre complex at the center of the Lumbee community now. And that's been burned about 95% in the past years. And you can see from this graphic how cultural burns are quite different, often from prescribed burns. It's more mosaic and less hot, with particular interest in the understory and access. So the Lumbee are self-defined as the people of the dark water, the Lumbee River, which you can see in the middle picture here. And you can see how dark water is very evocative for what they're surrounded by in the Lumbee River with the cypress coming out of it. And this Lumbee River circles the cultural center, so it's very central to their historical and cultural identity. And the informants I talked to evocatively described how they couldn't reach the river through the forests that were in place that hadn't been burned. So really cultural burning was a way to access the river and sort of collapse some of the boxes that we put fire and water into in our own society. And it led me to think, which was not something they were producing, but just my own perspective, that we just went through this pretty horrific experience at Western North Carolina of massive flooding. And yet we really don't have a single view about water as a disastrous material. So while we had widespread destruction and many deaths from a water emergency, we still also look to water as very much a part of our life as life-giving and life-sustaining and integral to our social structure. And what I was hearing from the Lumbee was this attitude towards fire, that fire is actually part of their, or was, and increasingly is becoming again, part of their daily life in ways that were more normalized than what we might see in Neo-European culture. And so on the right, you can see what to me became a very important element was that children were involved and are involved, and this has been replicated for me in speaking with people on the West Coast in these practices. And this gets back to my IRB story about not doing site visits. UNC Charlotte felt like it was too dangerous for me to be on the fire line, despite being an EMS physician and in the process of red carding. It was just felt to be this sort of disastrous, catastrophic space. Whereas this is really a different way. I think that the Lumbee would approach it where it is Tuesday. It's the day that they're burning this part of the community, and there's all sorts of community members there, including children. So I hope it's becoming apparent here that what I was learning from the Lumbee is the concepts of a culture that holds fire to be central and interdependent, and which treats it in a routine way with deep implications for health. In particular, really interesting story. They had legacy seeds that had been in families for generations that were fire dependent and during less fire tolerant political eras of the 20th century had not been planted, and they've collected those seeds and now they're growing them in their community center in these um, cultural fire spaces, and that's a health element. And I think the quote that losing fire sovereignty, which sovereignty is a very, I know there's Native audience members here right now, and I'm very humbled to say that sovereignty is a very complex topic, and I think they were very compelling in teaching me that sovereignty is not necessarily granted from an entity like a federal government, but there was some degree of, in this accommodation phase, giving up the capacity to burn where they wanted, when they wanted, and that loss of that fire sovereignty changed the ability of them to grow and manage their food sources, which is central to public health, which led to a change in health parameters. Robeson County, where the Lumbee are based, is by almost any metric one of the most marginalized and impoverished counties in North Carolina. And so losing the health through loss of fire sovereignty is a very important statement, I think. On the flip side, I think in the context of importance, I love the quote that like doing burns as part of your daily life. They described growing up and sort of burning fields as what they did, as a chore for their childhood, and that's like making a big deal out of making breakfast. So when I said earlier that my positionality as an anthropologist could be problematic per se, it's because of this book. And some of you may be familiar with it. This was by an anthropologist named Omer Stewart with a T. And he wrote this book in 1954 at the height of the militaristic suppression era. He was an anthropologist, and he lined up against Julian Stewart with a D, who's a very famous anthropologist of the day, was director of the Smithsonian, and treated Native American communities as museum pieces or fossilized cultures, argued they had no right or ability to manage land, and lined up against Stewart with a T in multiple California cases that were exploring whether Native communities could or should be allowed to manage land. And Omer Stewart was pointing out his evidence that across the country, native burning was widespread and was very functional. And he won every court case that he was involved in. His anthropology career plummeted. He didn't get prestigious positions despite being a very promising anthropologist, and nobody would publish his book. It was published in 2002 with a really amazing foreword from an ecologist and anthropologist. And I did not find this book in my literature search in anthropology. And it was introduced to me by a member of the Lumbee Indian tribe. So this is an ancient history. Stewart died in 1992 and tried to publish this a few months before his death. So I think the evidence here of subjectivity, of pettiness, of frank racism, of anthropology in the 20th century couldn't be lost on Native Americans who had read this book, and the idea that Native Americans are not collaborators in the space and reading the same materials as non-Indian students is silly and equally racist. So I think this work also required me digging up the ghosts of some recently dead anthropologists and grappling with their legacy, and to some extent, being given the grace and trust to help resurrect this book, which I really commend to you. It's amazing. That explores some of these ways that fire was looked at differently in communities that lived in the same spaces as we live in now. So kind of wrapping up, where I'm going with this is that there's an opportunity, I think, for us to normalize fire and the fire experience in our community. Some of this can be the transmission of traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, into that space, and there's a danger for appropriation. So I think some of the concerns that I and others might have about work utilizing these historical elements is that they can become a clause, a pen on a sentence, and this was done for millennia before, which really simplifies and flattens a very complicated social reality. But as one of the Lumbee archaeologists that I spoke to said quite compellingly and evocatively, if you don't include information from what was done in this space and land hundreds of years before European arrival, you're equally discarding and marginalizing important work. So what I would argue for the paradox of the mainstream based on this data is that wildland firefighters are exoticized in the fire world. They are held up as the special forces of the fire community, but they're also marginalized and underpaid and undersupported. In the arc of history, I think this was not something that was marginal or that was seen as exotic. This was very much the mainstream. And paradoxically, mainstream campaigns now that try to look to good fire, seek to recruit some of these previously marginalized indigenous practices to make their point. So we could do prescribed burns, and it was done for centuries, which is probably important to recognize, but also important to problematize and to dig deeper into what was really going on. And that some of these indigenous practices are happening now translated into cultural burning. And so it's a little bit perverse to speak about this happening centuries ago when it's happening now in North Carolina next to me in a Lumbee community and not be talking to the Lumbee Indians doing that work about what their experiences are and how they might find it to be functional. And so just as a very material manifestation of that, I did a great session with the North Carolina Forest Service. It was a wonderful day. I spent learning about protecting houses and making them more defensive against or defensible against wildland fires. And that speaks to this idea about normalizing fire into something that could have impacts on your home the same way flooding might, but that there's ways to prevent it. And I think that dialogue is important for us as we seek to maybe bring more mainstream understanding of fire into our communities. So in putting on my public health hat, just to talk about some of the policy implications, I think coming out of this, I think many of us on this webinar would agree that we need to support wildland firefighters better in the ways that they're compensated. This is obviously widely different between non-government organizations to state governments to federal governments, but across the board, I think improvements can be made there, not just for compensation, but for things like health benefits. And I think really the safety equipment we use is a really interesting topic that needs further exploration. And there's a lot of opportunity to gather data there, both about what the health risks are and how we could mitigate them, but also about what the culture is of what safety equipment is felt to be acceptable. I think public health messaging that we do needs to be informed by risk communication theory. And really, I think it needs to normalize wildland fire, which is challenging, but some of the deep ecology and counter hegemony dialogues point out that wildland fires don't consume forests. They don't destroy them. They're not catastrophic. They're not devastating. And I think that's so much in the media that we continue to portray that Smokey Bear message, which probably could be modified to a more sophisticated risk benefit and hey, it's in our community story the same way that water is. And I think that we need to do more research in the health parameters. Part of the reason why there's a paucity of it here is because there's a paucity of it in the world, and that's something which needs to be funded and explored. And I think this is an example of how not to do the public health messaging and share research. So this is from this month's American College of Cardiology, and this is catastrophizing. So the complexity of climate change, is a bit beyond what we're talking about today, unless you want to talk about it in the discussion. But this message is exoticism. It's exacerbating the paradox of the mainstream, suggesting, the world's on fire. And in fact, none of this is new. There's always been wildfires. Exclusively linking wildfires to climate change and extreme weather is the opposite of normalizing this kind of information. And finally, as I said, I think there's ways that we can normalize just our abilities to create communities that accommodate fire as part of their reality. And North Carolina Forest Service has a really, really nice website that I've linked for here that just talks about some of these ways to make homes more resilient. This drops it really down to the most intimate of spaces, people's homes. But I think many people in the community would have no idea that there's inexpensive ways that they can protect their homes. So one of the most important messages I got from the Cultural Burn Association as a collaborator with them was to tell the story, which is what I tried to do quickly here and share that there is, as one of the informants told me, another way to think about fire in our community. And so I'm doing that here a bit. This is sharing the research with y'all partly as a payback to the communities that gave me data, but also part of the effort to try to share the story that people who aren't often heard in our community have information about this. And many of you already work in the space and are already aware of cultural burning and the way that it might inform both wildland firefighter safety and health, as well as just general community. Many are not, but I think these stories themselves need to fight the paradox of the mainstream and become a normalized part of our dialogue. So that was today, and I hope there's publications coming out of this later. This is a picture I'll close with of the Bee Rock Creek fire. 180 personnel were assigned to the fire a couple days ago when I first presented this. McDowell County is being evacuated. This is in Hurricane Helene affected areas, super rugged, very vertical terrain. So this is complex and threatening and problematic. And I can't think of a topic that would more benefit from the unique intersectional skills of anthropology. And in particular, especially with the legacy of the 20th century, I think applied anthropologists need to do a better job of working and researching in the space. So with that, I will stop sharing and I'm open to David and questions.
Well, Seth, thank you so much for that presentation. That was fantastic. I know we got some questions already in the Q&A. We're going to get to those in just a moment. If anybody else has questions or comments that you'd like to share with Dr. Hawkins, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A tool in Zoom, and we'll use those to kind of guide our conversation going forward. When you look at the Q&A, you'll see that there's a little thumb or thumbs up. If you see a question from someone else, then you say, golly, I hope they get to that question. Go ahead and give it a thumbs up, and that'll help us to prioritize and get through those in the time that we have available. Awesome presentation. Lots of things to think about and talk about. I have a sheet over here on my desk of some questions and things that I want to ask you. I want to make sure we get to these questions that some folks have already posted. So Lou has a question in here, and Lou says, what is a responsible answer to the argument of prescribed fire contributing to climate change? Who says, I have been asked this question personally and was unsure if my answer was correct or appropriate.
Lou, what's your answer?
I don't know. You can put it in the chat, Lou.
Yeah, I can speak to it and I'd love to hear what you say. And I think this is what we're all asking. So we're a young country and we're forever thinking that we've been doing this stuff forever and that we've been around forever. Neither of those are true. We are, I think, and again, I'm humbled to say I'm speaking in a community of people who are actually quite active in research and practice around this. I think we're in the business right now of trying to find out whether prescribed fire is the better answer than fire suppression. I'm also cognizant that there's a potential draft executive order circulating right now that may radically change all of this, and the era of prescribed fires may become historical, like that. Maybe another installment on that slide. So all this is very open to negotiation, and I think the exciting thing about that and being in a time of change is that we can hold on to those things that work and discard those that don't. I might even bounce this to people here with North Carolina State University. I know have been doing work in this space, but my understanding is that prescribed fires would be considered a more responsible and less environmentally impactful way to recognize that there will be wildland fires in our community. And part of the message that I would send out is that philosophy, not necessarily to prevent wildland fires, but to integrate fire into our social milieu, is what's been going on much, much longer than we've been the United States of America, and that you could argue whether or not native practices are themselves responsible, or I think there can be some romanticization there. On the other hand, I think it's felt to be more integrated into the rhythms of the world around us. And in that sense, I think it's worth exploring. And this is exactly where I would say it's worth generating more data around it. I'm curious if other people have uh, more experience with that.
I'll chime in. I think of this question from a carbon standpoint. And there's research that shows most of our fires that are prescribed, particularly in frequent fire systems in the southeast, but it applies certainly elsewhere as well, are burning carbon that was recently uh, sequestered into plant material. And so if you're burning in an annual plot, most of what you're burning is just material that has been accumulated over the past fire cycle, the fire interval, right? And so you end up burning up carbon that was sequestered within that fire interval, such that it almost ends up being kind of a closed loop. And in the process of doing that, there's also evidence that we're contributing and building up carbon pools in the soil through the creation of charcoal and black carbon. And those soil carbon pools are moving carbon that is in this, frequent cycle of atmosphere to photosynthesis to plant material to burning. But you're taking a portion of that over time and moving it into long-term carbon pools, which are in the soil, which are then going to be, uh, you know, long-term carbon stores. So you're actually taking some of that out of this frequent burning cycle and putting it down into the ground where there's evidence that it can stay there for a very long time. So there's also other evidence from a carbon standpoint that frequent prescribed burning helps to make the carbon stocks more resilient to wildfires, and such that instead of having a high severity fire come in where you have significant loss of the overstory into to carbon dioxide through burning, you maintain more of your long-term carbon storage in the boles and the stems of trees that are going to be able to survive. There's evidence from that, from studies um, in Arizona, and I can't remember the author's name right now, but I'll remember it in about 10 minutes. That was able to show where prescribed burning and modeling systems basically created more resilient forests that were going to be able to sustain carbon in the face of wildfires and climate change. So,
There's
yeah,
some great points also coming up in the thread and
yeah.
answers to that point, which is this is why webinars are so great. So I
For
would defer to all these points. I think one quick anthropological point to come out of this is that anthropologists would argue that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Um, all disasters have some component of anthropogenicity, but also are constructed as events that are seen as catastrophic and disasters. So I think, an important point to Lou's point about helping to prevent more catastrophic fires, the idea of a catastrophic fire is based on our perception of what it's catastrophic about it. So is it that we're sad that trees are burning? Is it we're sad that communities are up in flames, that people die? All those things are potentially important and catastrophic and sad, but that's a complete construction of our own making. And that's, I think, an anthropological contribution to say we need to somewhat disengage the ecology and our own perceptions about how we want that ecology to be. One of the most interesting stories I heard was somebody, mentioning how sad it was that there was fires around sequoias, and the point was made that these are fire dependent species, and that actually we romanticize something being the way it always is. And I think the other point to that that's just really crucial is this is particularly American, have this conservation ethic of keeping things the way they are now for our grandchildren, and that unwillingness to accommodate change can be ecologically problematic, because obviously we know the way of the world is change, evolution, transition. And I think that was something the Lumbee informants I spoke with were very helpful with, is they were saying that in fact this ecosystemic cultural burning was moving materials through a cycle in a way that they were collaborating with, but it was not controlling, which is different than a prescribed burn model. And I think that collaborative characteristic of allowing natural processes to evolve is just not something we're very familiar with. But I think it's important in a conservation or ecology movement to recognize that change can be an expected and not necessarily catastrophic process, even as there's some heartburn on our part about it.
I want to get to this question that's in the Q&A. And this person says, did you speak with the Lumbee folks about the idea of good fire versus bad fire? They say it reads to me as very much growing from a colonial paradigm in which everything is designated as either good or bad, versus a more commonly held Native American perspective of the need for balance among forces and elements. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, while I don't know that I specifically asked that question, you are 100% right about my perception of what I was hearing, and I am guessing that's coming from your own experience. So of course I appreciate and acknowledge that as well. And that was my experience, was that there was some pragmatic benefit to people performing cultural burning, attaching themselves to a movement which had scientific and mainstream um, recognition. However, the entirety of my experience talking with them and walking the land that they are managing in this way was the removal of these boxes. And literally the words they said were, "We don't put fire in a box." And I think you're absolutely right that this is where Thomas did interesting work about colonialism. And I think even disattaching it from that structure and just talking about it as a neo-European model, we like to categorize things, and we're lumpers and splitters, and this is what we as scientists do, and it's very important to us. And it was just very interesting to work with people for whom that was a recognized system that they could accommodate themselves to, but it was not the one that their own community embraced in its original form, and that fire and water were very continuous. And we now know that they're not elements in the classical way. One is a state and one is a compound. Um, but we tend to think of them still like the Greeks as like these elements that have like these spiritual uh, components that are at odds, or in this case, that all that was something that uh, was made up in my head at least. And as I talk to them, what you're saying is exactly right. That there wasn't this valence of good or bad, which honestly, I think this was not from them. This is just my own thinking and being kind of a water guy. And that's my specialty, is drowning and water safety. And I just realized that we do not talk about good water and bad water. It's the leading cause of death for many age groups in many parts of the world. One county commission successfully banned it in California when a group of pranksters showed them like dihydrogen oxide and what a dangerous chemical it was, and they banned dihydrogen oxide from appearing in their county. It's exceptionally dangerous for our social structure and our us as organisms. Maybe more so, numerically than fire, but obviously it's also like an incredibly important part of many sacramental elements in religions. And we die after a couple days without ingesting water. So yes, yes to everything you said.
That's a great analogy. I'm glad you were able to get to that. I have shifted my perspective on good fire versus bad fire and good fire versus bad smoke as well. And I think I it's just too simplistic, and that, the reality of a lot of wildfires is that they can do good work on the landscape, and those may be unplanned ignition, and yes, they have really profound impacts on communities and on watersheds and on people's lives and homes and things like that. But wildfires can also have great fire effects from an ecological standpoint, and they can do a great job in some cases. And in many cases, the same fire will have some areas where it's doing wonderful things for ecosystems, in areas that agencies and structures have struggled to be able to put fire back into those places from a prescribed fire perspective and framework. And yet wildfire was able to do that work. At the same time, the same fires, as you're getting to as well, the same fires can also be responsible for tragedies and really, really awful things. And
And if I
so,
can just double down
yeah,
on that for 1 second to reinforce the anthropology public health side, this is where they're so complementary and so important, I think, to this topic. So, Good Fire, Bad Fire is a public health campaign. Hard stop. It is public health, and it is attempting to transmit meaning and a agenda to the community. And that's what public health is really good at and should be really good at and is involved with. Um, what anthropology is really good at is problematizing topics, looking for positionality and power, and looking for voices that offer alternative perspectives. And what you're describing is exactly the way those can work together. There can be a very powerful public health campaign that can be better informed by an anthropological inquiry into the underlying assumptions and what maybe other voices have to say about it. There can be a great analysis from anthropology, but without a public health, arm to kind of operationalize it, it ends up being very abstract. So, to those of you that are interested in this kind of work, this is where I think these are very complementary topics because honestly, public health is everywhere and is very common. Anthropology is seen as sort of esoteric, but has so much to bring to the table of asking what is good fire and bad fire, and what do other people have to say about it, and what does that say about our perspectives, and what are the degrees to which that's pragmatic or it actually represents something which that's ecological value. And those are just important dialogues.
well, we could go on, but I think we should probably wrap things up. I want to say thank you so much, Dr. Hawkins, for coming and sharing this with us. I think, you know, coming into this from a truly interdisciplinary nature and coming in to fire from different perspectives shows, and I think even just within the last hour and change, I think we've all learned that this is something we should all be doing more often to help us learn from each other, to help learn from different disciplines, and to tackle challenges that, you know, can't be faced just from a science perspective or just from a public health or anthropological perspective. We working together, I think we all bring different lenses and eyes to this, and this has been fun. So with that, I'm going to share our last slide here. And if you all have questions for Dr. Hawkins or like to follow up with him, we've got his email address on the screen. We're a little bit over on time, but Seth, do you have any final comments or remarks that you'd like to share with everybody today before we wrap things up?
I want to just thank you all for being here and for the work that many of you do. Again, I'm a student of this. Many of you are practitioners and experts of it. And I guess the last thing I would say is those of you that are hopping on that weren't aware about the complexity of wildland fire and just saw the sort of catastrophic dialogue in the media, I hope you've gotten a more insightful and complicated idea about how wildland fire probably is going to be coexisting with us for a long time. And we and the people on this webinar are working hard to make that as successful as possible for humans.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. This has been, like I said, this has been fun.